Hi, I'm Lauren Centrella, Interim Chief Development Officer at WAMU. I'd like to thank you all for attending the events this afternoon and welcome you to the author series. We're thrilled that you're joining us for our discussion on the book Demon Copperhead today. WAMU has deep roots as a media organization in service of the community. We are truth seekers and storytellers. We strive to expand our listeners' horizons, stir their souls, and help them engage in real and meaningful ways with their local, regional, and global community. And these author series do just that. This event and others like it are possible because of your donations. If you enjoy the discussion today, please consider making it an additional gift to support this series of events. You can donate at dianerehm.org/give. It's your donations that help us produce these events. And now, please welcome our host, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Lauren. And it's always good to be with all of our authors and our audience. And we're just delighted to have you with us. My guest this month, as part of our author interview series, is Barbara Kingsolver. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with Barbara many, many times over the years. She's a poet, an essayist, and the author of 10 best-selling, award-winning novels. This includes The Bean Trees, The Poisonwood Bible, and 2022's Demon Copperhead. In this latest work, she turns her attention to her own region of Appalachia and the communities devastated by opioid addiction. With an unforgettable narrator and an assist from Charles Dickens, she once again uses the art of socially aware storytelling to guide readers toward deep empathy and understanding. If you have questions for Barbara Kingsolver, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. And Barbara, I'm so thrilled you could join us. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Barbara, you know, the last time we were together was in a huge auditorium at Sidwell Friends School here in Washington, D.C.
That's
so
right.
Now you are in your own home in Demon Copperfield land.
That's right. Demon is my neighbor. Demon lives on or just down the road from me. Well, really, of course, Demon lives inside my brain.
Of course.
But absolutely, I wrote this novel because I am Appalachian. This is where I live. I feel really a duty, sort of a moral obligation, as well as a passion to represent my region with honesty, with compassion, and with nuance, because people in the rest of the country and the rest of the world don't really see Appalachia. They see a joke. They see hillbillies made into a sort of a trope, a dumb joke, or they see a poverty documentary, but they don't see the real Appalachia. So that's what I try to do in my work. And Demon Copperhead really came from, in addition to that sort of duty to my people, my deep worry about what has happened to us in the last couple of decades. Well, really the last 15 years with the opioid epidemic. I think that it's something people need to know about. We have a generation of lost kids here who need your compassion and your understanding.
And the fact that you got into Demon Copperhead's head in the way you did, his voice, I mean, using an F-bomb, football playing, drug addicted teenage boy. How did you manage to find him in you?
Well, I mean, yeah, in some sense, I channeled my inner teenage boy. He's in there. I've honestly, I'm lucky and glad to say I haven't lived his life. I was luckier in the sort of the family lottery, generally speaking, but I know the territory. I know what it's like to be bullied in school. I know what it's like to be self-conscious when you don't fit in. And also, I mean, just on the teenage boy department, I raised 2 daughters. So I've spent, a lot of the last 20 years with teenage boys in my house. So I know I know the territory.
Well, you said you know what it is to be bullied. Are
Mhm.
you talking about yourself?
Yeah. I was a kid who didn't fit in. I am extremely introverted. Um, I was a really shy kid. I was the one who never spoke in class. I was bookish. Um, I was a dreamer. I read books and then I imagined worlds made out of those books. And I, I grew up in a rural part of Kentucky where being dreamy and bookish is not sort of not the lay of the land. I was really kind of an outcast. So
Were there perhaps teachers who supported your love of reading and recognized your shyness for what it was?
as Demon would say, not so you'd notice. And that's not fair. I mean, I had a couple of good teachers who made a difference in my life, especially later on. But something that I wanted to address in Demon Copperhead is the culture of education in this rural part of the country has been really badly damaged by, in the same way that employment has been damaged by the outside forces, largely the coal companies that came in here and really, really bought up everything, lock, stock, and barrel. They owned the hospitals, they owned the schools, they still sit on school boards. And the goal of the coal companies was to raise more coal miners. That meant, I mean, we're talking about a century of this kind of control of this region of the country. So they deliberately kept out all other forms of employment. That's why there's not a lot of other manufacturing in coal country. There are not a lot of other opportunities for jobs. And they deliberately suppressed the culture of education so that people didn't have the opportunities to learn. They didn't have, I mean, teachers were not rewarded. We didn't have special classes. We didn't have anything to encourage us to go to college. I was one of the few people in my high school class who even knew about college. I was very lucky to get to go to college, but generally speaking, education was not valued. And that's not to say it was not a beautiful place and a wonderful place. We had other things, other values, and there's a lot that I really treasure about Appalachia, which is why I still live here. I mean,
you write about that, the beauty of the country itself when Demon is pushed into a city. he misses
He
the
hates
green,
it.
the trees, and sees nothing but cement sidewalks.
And it's not just a physically, geographically beautiful place. It is it's a beautiful culture. We are people made of community. We help each other. We look out for each other. We know each other's business. We operate as families, sort of extended families. When you meet someone here for the first time, the first time you sit down and talk to somebody, the conversation you have is, who are your people? And you keep talking, and that's inevitable. It's always the first thing you do. Who are your people? And you talk until you find the point of intersection, either a relative, an ancestor you have in common, or someone who knows somebody in your family, or something that you did for somebody or they did for you. It's just, you find that point of intersection, and then you talk about whatever else there is to talk about. But it's something I think about that a lot, because it's just built into us to connect, and that is rare. And the way I tried to it's funny that our culture is so urban centric. Everything we see on TV, all of our movies, our newspapers, everything comes from cities. It is made in cities by people who live in cities, mostly about things that city people care about. Rural folks just don't see ourselves on TV, and so, or in magazines or anywhere. So, except as I previously mentioned, as a bad joke. So, I thought it would be interesting. I mean, naturally, the presumption is that nobody would want to live out there if they could help it. So I kind of had a good time writing about Demon going to cities and offer it, because he does that a few times. Knoxville is the largest city near here. Well, it's 2 hours away from here. I don't live close to any city, but Knoxville is 2 hours away. So Demon has a couple of occasions to go to Knoxville, and then ultimately lives there for a while. And I thought it'd be interesting to show his perspective.
Exactly.
He hates it. He says
He hates it.
there is no outside anywhere.
Yeah.
Believe me, he says, I looked. He's in his Aunt June's apartment, and it's just doors opening to doors, into hallways, into other doors. He likens it to there's an old video game called Duke Nukem,
Yes.
where Duke is just stuck in this like maze of, it's like the Doom Castle. He's stuck in this castle, and every door opens into another hallway, and there's more doors and more doors, and he never can get outside. And that's what Demon felt like, the Doom Castle. And he notices, this is when he's older, nobody looks you in the eye.
Right.
Where I live, you look at, when you see somebody, not only do you look at them, you wave at them, you interact. So he's really weirded out by living in the city and walking down the street, and nobody makes eye contact, nobody's looking at each other.
Now, I want to ask you about the fact that you said the education was deliberately downplayed. That was presumably so you'd have more coal miners. Is that right?
I think so. I think it was all really pretty much done to us. And then after a while, the culture becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is when you have a culture that encourages strength rather than intelligence, that sort of persists. And it's the strong people, or sort of more blustery people who are less interested in thoughtfulness, who rise to power and kind of keep that going, if you know what I mean. So this is a problem that we deal with in a really active way in this region. It's something that was done to us that it takes time and effort and resources to reverse. And it's all sort of built in. If there aren't rewards, if education if there aren't great jobs that you could get nearby, if you had the diploma, if you had the college degree, then, you know, if there's no reward, why do the work? And so this is what we call institutional poverty, structural poverty. I didn't really know that that's what I was going to be writing about when I entered this story, but
and you must have done so much research on that kind of not only institutional poverty, but foster care, and how young children were treated in foster care. It was really appalling.
Yeah.
And I presume you took that from factual information.
Oh, absolutely. Nothing here is exaggerated. Everything in this book has happened to somebody I know. Fortunately, not all of it. That's what I did, is I took all of the bad luck and I gave it to one kid. But yeah, well, I mean, number one, my principal line of research is living here, living where I do, having lived most of my life here and paying attention. But I also, there are things you just don't know till you go digging. I didn't know that much about the foster care system. I was stunned when I began talking with people and asking specifically about how it works. I was stunned to learn it's run as a for-profit business. So foster kids essentially are products. That's not just here, that's everywhere. But the trouble here is that because of this structural poverty and the opioid epidemic and all the other stuff that's been done to us, we have this generation of kids falling through the cracks, this generation of a huge number of kids who can't be raised by their parents because their parents are incarcerated or dead.
Exactly.
So it's worse here than anywhere else because the system is so strained that there aren't enough homes. There aren't enough good homes for these kids. They have to be placed in, you know, less than ideal circumstances. And worst of all, and this is an everybody problem, that just as teachers, as we know, teachers are underpaid, mental health care workers and DSS workers DSS workers are paid less than teachers, much less than teachers. It's a job that nobody stays in for very long. It's a really hard, heartbreaking job that's not rewarded. So people get out of that job as soon as they can. So that means there's a lot of turnover. I didn't know this important fact. When a kid is in foster care, his DSS worker is his legal guardian.
Wow.
And these people, these are the underpaid people who turn over very quickly. So these files get passed around, and it's a pretty common circumstance for a kid not to know the name of his legal guardian and vice versa, because their files get shuffled around and lost. Imagine, that's the value we place on our kids, on our country's future. It's well, there's a lot of thinking we need to do about where we put our resources.
Absolutely. And I want you to know that many of our viewers and listeners have questions they've already submitted. This is a great first question. Which came first, the desire to tell the story of Lee County, Virginia, or the desire to pen a modern day David Copperfield? I'm so interested in how the idea was born.
Well, I can easily answer that question. What came first was the desire to tell the story, not necessarily of one boy, but to tell the story of Lee County, Scott County, Russell County, this region where I live, and what has happened to it, and what we're dealing with because of the opioid epidemic. That was my starting point. And the voice, the devil on my shoulder kept saying, nobody wants to hear that, Barbara. It is so sad. It is so depressing.
And you introduced humor into this.
How do I tell this story? Honestly, I spent 2 or 3 years just walking around that house, that story, trying to find my way in, because I was too aware and too oppressed by all my notion of what people already thought they knew about this. There's a lot of people have a lot of preconceived notions about Appalachians, hillbillies, poverty. It's like people deserve to be poor. I mean, it's, they wouldn't say that out loud, but it's kind of like something that many people think. They just didn't work hard enough or whatever.
Right.
And worst of all, people who are addicted to drugs, because we've had this, honestly, 50-year brainwashing project called the War on Drugs that has taught us all that addicts, so-called addicts, are criminals and need to be locked up. It's something that they chose. They could have just said no. So thinking about all of those prejudices, how am I going to break through? It just
then you were in England.
Yes. So you want me to tell the story of my
Yes.
visit from a ghost? I really was just at the end of my rope. I really wanted to tell a story, and I didn't know who or how to get in. And I was at the end of a book tour in London. My the UK part of my book tour is always last, and I was worn out and kind of deliriously tired. And I had a weekend before going home, and I booked myself into this country inn. It's on the seacoast in Broadstairs. It's called Bleak House because Charles Dickens lived there, and that is where he wrote David Copperfield. I just had this vague, I thought, well, that would be cool. I'll just go there. I didn't imagine it would be very Dickensy. It was really Dickensy.
Really?
It was this bleak house, this brick mansion on the cliff overlooking the sea, and it was November. It was stormy and dark, and my husband flew over to join me, and we got to Bleak House and knocked on the door, and the door creaked open, and it was like we had stepped into a Charles Dickens novel. The guy at the desk was like Bob Cratchit, and there was nobody else here, and so they said, make yourselves at home.
Yeah.
And so I just prowled around this creaky house, and at the end of a hallway on the second floor was Charles Dickens's study. This little room with his desk, the windows where he sat and looked out at the sea, the place where he wrote David Copperfield. It was a smallish room full of his stuff, manuscripts and things.
Wow.
And I was captivated, sort of mesmerized. And it was late. I told Stephen, just go to bed. I just need to sit here with Charles Dickens. And I started feeling him just like coming up through the floor. And what I felt was outrage, anger. David Copperfield is his story. It's a story of a kid who's just like him, it was Dickens's life.
Yes.
We know that now. His
Yes.
father went to prison for being poor. He had to go to work when he was 8 years old. He wrote this story because he was mad. So I hear this, I just really feel this vibration saying, you think you can't write about poverty, about orphans? Give me a break. People will read this stuff. He said, you let the kid, he didn't say kid, he said, you let the child tell the story.
He
I
did
just
say
heard
that.
those
Oh, my
words. Let the child tell the story.
God.
So I started writing this book on his desk that night. I just got this vision of my David Copperfield, Demon Copperhead, with red hair and attitude. And I thought, what if I just lay out David Copperfield and try to transpose it on my place and time, because it's got a cracking good plot, really great characters. what if I just move this plot and these characters into what if I bring them home with me? And that's what I did. And I'm sitting at my desk right here. This is where I write. And Charles Dickens was right here at my elbow the whole time, telling me, you can do this.
Just beautifully, beautifully done.
Thank
Every
you.
single character came alive. But I read David Copperfield after I read your own book, Demon Copperhead, and I'm glad I did, because as you've indicated, it would have ruined the whole story.
Well, there are a lot of spoilers. You would have known the ending.
Exactly.
But on the good side, you see all my little private jokes with Charles Dickens a lot.
Yes.
I mean, it was really challenging to try to, figure out, like, what's the modern day equivalent of a shoe black factory. I know, a gas and go market with a meth lab in the back, and the characters, naming the characters. So Steerforth becomes fast forward, and
the Macabres.
Right, the Macabres become the Macabres, keeping their same sort of avarice, and avarice isn't the right word. Their perpetual worry about money and their fear of looking poor, even though
and Uriah Heep.
And Uriah Heep, right, becomes U-Haul piles.
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes it was really hard to figure out how to transpose, a Victorian situation into 21st century Appalachia, but it was also really fun. It was just like, I was sort of like chortling all the way through it, because
and I want to ask you about that, because one of our listeners, hearing you say, I was a very shy young girl, I never spoke up, wants to know how you developed your delightful sense of humor.
Oh, quiet people are the funniest ones, believe me. If you could read the bubble over their head, you would just die.
I like that idea.
Well, the one thing I knew is that this book had to have an engine, a powerful engine, because it's a long, hard story, and there are sections that are so painful to read.
Yes.
They were very painful to write. I cried a lot of times for Demon. I kept wanting to save him, like when he's when he runs away and he's in the truck stop and the woman's gonna get his money, and I kept saying, I can't do this to him. But then you don't have a novel. So it takes you to such dark places that I had to give you two things. One is this promise that he's going to make it. Somehow or other, you had to know that to keep reading. And, the obvious thing is it's first person. That was, my genius tip from my friend Charles Dickens. Let the kid tell the story. That gives you a leg up for several reasons. One is a first person voice is very compelling, especially from a child, because you want to believe the kid. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt in a special way that we don't necessarily do for adults. So it gets you on his side right away. But the other great thing about a first person narrative is he's going to survive. He's going to make it, because he's telling you this from the end. He's not going to die. So that was my promise. He's going to make it. And I also had to build a kind of resilience into his voice, into his character, that would make you trust that you can throw your chips in with Demon. He's going to make it.
But at the same time, he was never sure of himself.
Well,
along the way, he didn't understand why people listened to him.
Right. But the other thing, the other sort of the fuel for this engine is his voice, his irony, his sense of humor, his way of he just like makes a little sarcastic, he puts a little sarcastic punctuation of his own onto every situation. If I can make you laugh even while you're crying, then I hope you'll keep going.
Indeed.
And that's, I think that's it's sort of Southern Gothic, right? I mean, this I learned from, well, everything I know about writing, I learned from reading. I didn't go to school to learn to be a writer. I actually, in college, I studied biology, as a matter of fact, and in graduate school. But I learned to be a writer by reading. And I read everything, but I really loved the Southern sort of, like Flannery O'Connor is so funny, and she's so dark. That I think that's where I learned the lesson that you can tell the darkest story if you put some sauce in it.
When did you and how did you get the courage to finally put pen to paper?
Oh, that took no courage at all, because nobody knew I was doing it. I wrote in private for 20 years. I started writing like in a daily way. On my 8th birthday, somebody gave me, actually, I think I can show it to you.
Good. A notebook, no question, that has your earliest.
This is it.
Writing.
This is actually, that's handy that I'm sitting right here.
It's a diary.
This a 5-year diary. Anybody remember these?
Of
And
course.
it has the little lock key lock there, which can be opened. My brother showed me with a bobby pin, but but there's really nothing in here that would be worth stealing. Can I read?
Oh, of course.
For now, then I went in the kitchen, blah, blah, blah. So boring. But but somehow or other, just all of these pages invited me. Oh, there's my sister scribbled on that one.
Oh my gosh.
These pages invited me to put my experience on paper, and I kept doing it. I loved it. I wrote almost every day for years and years and years. You can't see because it's low, but there's the whole lineup of all of my notebooks. I graduated from these to just regular, ring-bound notebooks, but somehow translating my lived experience into words and writing them down gave me that feeling like life is a river passing me by, and I can pin it to its banks. I can keep it. I don't know, maybe other people take pictures or do social media for that reason, but it just gratified me. I felt good about it. And the more you do something, the better you get at it, I suppose, generally speaking.
So you sent your first real book off to an agent or a publishing house when?
1987. The same year I had my first baby. So we're jumping ahead from the from the eighth birthday diary to I did a lot of writing. In high school, I wrote, which, as I said, I never showed to anybody, so it took no courage at all. I wrote poems, well, teenage poems, oh, woe is me, and little stories. Interestingly, I didn't think about that until just now. All of my early short stories were about little boys in trouble. Little boys with some kind of dire circumstance. I don't know why, but I guess I was like practicing for Demon Copperhead all my life.
Isn't that
so
interesting?
then in college, even though I was studying biology, I wrote slightly more sophisticated short stories and a lot of poetry. Then, like after college, in graduate school, I was discouraged from writing poetry. My committee said, I hope we won't see any more of that.
Wow. Wow.
Science and art are not always friends. But my first job out of grad school was as a writer, a scientific writer. I got paid actually by the University of Arizona
I
to
see.
write scientific, like science, to translate science for a lay audience. So writing was a paycheck. And then I sort of jumped from there to freelancing. I wrote for magazines and newspapers. I covered a copper strike. I just started
And
making.
your first book was?
Well, actually, the first book I wrote was about a mine strike. These women, these really brave women in Arizona who held the line on a very violent, scary copper mine strike in the early 80s. I wrote that book just because I was covering it for a newspaper, for a couple of newspapers and magazines. I was a stringer. I kept going back and interviewing these women weekend after weekend. And so after a while, I heard them say, "Oh, here's that gal that's writing a book about us." So I thought, "Oh, I guess I have to write a book about them." And so I did, but I didn't imagine it could get published. Then during my first pregnancy, when I was 31, I wrote a novel just because I had to write a novel. I didn't think anybody was going to read it. I just needed to write it. And it was called The Bean Trees. And right before I went into labor, I thought, I got to get this out of the house. I could either throw it away or send it off to an agent. And so I did the second.
Oh, and what a success it was.
So I got the call that it was going to be published the same day I brought my daughter home from the hospital. So I became a mother and an author on the same day. And
how fabulous.
And there's my life. So yeah, I was kind of out of the closet then.
And here is a question regarding that. So when the therapist asked Demon to keep a journal, did it remind you of your own journal and what that writing had done for you?
Well, that's an interesting question. Did that therapist remind me of myself? I actually made that therapist up. So, but I mean, I know what you're getting at. Well, well, sure. I mean, of course, I know the value of journaling from experience, but I also, I was actually on like the 14th or 15th draft of this novel. I rewrite a lot. I revise a lot. Every sentence you read, by the time you read it, has been rewritten between 7 and 35 times. I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. That's where the art really arrives, in my opinion. A first draft is like, I'm sure I've said this before, even to you, Diane, on a show, because I always say it. A first draft is like hoeing a row of corn. You're just getting to the end of it. It's just labor. Then the art begins, because once you've gotten to the ending, you can pull it back and make everything, just like weave everything together so that it all sort of, it all coheres. So
once
that
you
notion,
heard, you heard David,
Demon.
Once you heard Charles Dickens say into your head, let the boy tell it. The boy tell it.
Let the boy tell the story.
From the beginning of your belief in this story, how long did it take you to write Demon Copperhead? 3
years and a couple of months. From that night when I first started writing till I turned in the final draft was 3 years and 3 months. That's pretty typical. I always have it's like a gumball machine. When there's one waiting while one pops out. So okay, let's say a gumball machine with a really long tube. I'm always kind of contemplating the next one while I'm writing this one. So while I was writing Unsheltered, I was thinking about the Opioid Epidemic novel. I just didn't have a handle on it. So I started it really pretty much the minute I was finished with the book tour of Unsheltered. And that's kind of how it works. I'm thinking now, I mean, I have the next one cooking, but but just to go back, I didn't fully answer that journal question. Through the first several drafts of this novel, okay, he's telling the story, and it bothered me a little, even though evidently it didn't bother Dickens, but I kept asking myself, but who's he telling the story to? I mean, obviously he's telling it to you, but maybe it's the scientist in me, the rational being. I always feel like if there's a narration, there's an if there's an imaginary narration, there's an imaginary audience. And so I thought, who is he really writing this for or telling this to? Then I had that idea. How about it's his therapy journal? How about his therapist tells him, write it out, write it all down? And some readers, I mean, it's subtle, so some readers might not have noticed, but there's a moment where he actually reveals this. He says something like, she said, find that point where your addiction issues began, your abandonment issues began. And he says, that is a long, long road. You think it's here, and then you say, nope, back it up. And finally, you get to chapter 1. I got myself born. So he tells you at the end of like chapter 60 or something, that's what this is. This is him trying to make sense of his journey.
And here is what we have is not just a story of addiction. It's a story of a young man with perseverance. He doesn't really know he has perseverance, but he knows he has to keep going. And that is perseverance.
He doesn't have a choice, but there are people who give up and there are people who persist. Some of this is just, probably in our DNA. He says when the first time he actually hears this diagnosis that he's resilient is when the counselor and teacher, Mr. Armstrong, tells him, he's looked at his files and seen everything this kid has been through. And he says, well, I know one thing about you. You have resilience. And Demon thinks that's a disease. He says, are you going to give me drugs for that?
Yeah.
That's all he's ever heard is what's wrong with him. So no, he's not very self-aware, especially in the, it's an interesting thing to write to track a person from birth to, he's at the advanced age of probably late 20s when he's telling you this story. So in the beginning, he's naive, he has very little self-awareness, but it's also colored by the fact that it's a retrospective. So he has, it's okay to put up, slightly more adult language and kind of worldview and comprehension on the little kid, which makes it, of course, more interesting to read. Also, so that it's not like, this diary, I went in the kitchen. It's got to be, articulate.
Here is yet another question from a listener. As you mentioned about Appalachia being not well represented in society, media, how detrimental is this, in your perspective, to division and disharmony across our country? Is literature a way to raise this awareness, as the front headlines of the newspapers and television reports apparently don't seem able to shake loose? I mean, we just had another shooting yesterday with 3 young 9-year-olds killed. and 3 adults killed. You've got to write about gun control at some point.
Well, yeah, I think that I am. I think that, I mean, nobody wants to be told what to do, but at the bottom of this problem, well, is, the absurdity of allowing civilians to carry around weapons
Guns.
of war.
Yeah.
But also mental health care, which is just profoundly underfunded. There's just one of my daughters is a therapist. She works in mental health care, and I can't even begin to tell you how dire the mental health crisis is in this country. The therapist shortage is worse than the doctor shortage. It's worse than the mask shortage at the beginning of the pandemic. There are not even a quarter of enough therapists in this country to meet the need, and there's not enough sort of cognizance or compassion to devote resources to that. So a person who was diagnosed mentally ill was able to buy 7 weapons. Okay, unpack that for me. What kind of a country lets that happen? Many things are failing to connect. What I can do about that is write novels that perhaps generate compassion across some of these lines. I'm going to go back to the beginning of that question, which was a kind of beautifully asked and answered question. How detrimental is this? Okay, going back to how we never see rural people and our genuine concerns and our genuine intelligence and our lives and our challenges portrayed. It's a huge problem, and it's the reason we have such a political divide. I know, because I live here, people are so angry. People feel so, we're aware of your contempt. As Demon says, do they think we don't even have cable? When the late night TV comedians are making the jokes about, I used to date a girl from Kentucky, but then I found out she was lying through her tooth. This is like, I can't even, I can't watch comedians because of the way they make fun of rural people. We're aware of this. We are tired of this contempt and dismissiveness. And unfortunately, the toxic consequence of that is that there's a huge population in this country just willing to follow anybody who says, okay, I'm going to blow up the system. It's so bad. They won't hear us until we blow something up. That's dangerous. Obviously, but that's the problem. It's a failure of compassion, a failure of interest. If urban people could care more and listen better to rural people, and vice versa, I think we could bridge these divides. But we can't, I can't tell somebody to give up their AR-15s. And certainly somebody who lives in the city can't tell a rural person to give up his guns. We don't respond to that. And even presenting information isn't particularly useful if it's coming from someone that you don't think is on your side. We accept information from people we trust, from sources that we feel are on our side. That's why people who watch Fox News believe Fox News. They feel that those commentators are on their side, and people who listen to NPR listen to NPR. We all have our tribes. If you're trying to talk across these divides and you open with "you idiot," the conversation's over. They're not going to listen. We only listen to people who we feel want the best for us and like us and think we're real people.
Here's another question for you. what did you write into the story and character of Demon that you feel needed to be in place for Demon to persevere for as long as he did? How do you feel this translates to the needed resiliency and survival tools for our youth? This question is from the perspective of someone who studies mass violence, especially school mass violence and extremism.
Yeah.
It's that
Dis-
perseverance.
Yeah, well, and disconnection. I mean, what scares me is that kids, well, people in general, when they become disconnected from community, when the ties break, when everyone cuts them loose because they're too weird or too lonely or too depressed or too mad, then that person becomes a kind of a bomb. So availability of mental health resources, availability of teachers, of therapists, of friends, of helpers. I've read, and I think we all know it's true, that in the worst of lives, if a child has one adult, just one adult, they can really trust, who genuinely cares, genuinely, convinces them that they can be trusted, and provides helpful information. One caring adult can make a difference. We don't have enough of them. That's how thinly spread we are. So, I mean, it's something to think about, both, I mean, whether or not you're a professional, even if you're just a person who has a kid in your life, whether it's a relative or a neighbor or someone else's kid, if you can be that person, you could change somebody's world. You could change the entire trajectory of a child's life. But it would also be helpful to get them to, professional resources.
Here's a question. I love that Demon was quite completely alone with nature when he finally decided that if he was still alive in the morning, he would go find June and the help she offered. Was that particular healing connection with nature an intentional message?
Of course, absolutely. And it's something that I think as rural people, it's a resource we have, that's probably unimaginably important. During the pandemic, for example, I mean, I live in the middle of the woods, and during the pandemic, I just took long walks every day, and I would look at the trees and the owls and all the life forms around me and think, you guys don't even know, do you? This is not a problem. This is a people problem. And it kept things in perspective. We're one species. We think we're everything, but we're not. It's so valuable to us to have nature around us to keep us in perspective and to calm us down. And that was, if you think about it, a lot of the important moments in Demon's story happened when he was in communion with nature. That crucial one, when he's up on top of up at the sand cave. There's a moment when he's talking with Tommy when they're on Creaky Farm, and Creaky Farm is just about to get the better of them, but they go out to the, up in the field where Creaky can't see them, and Tommy's looking at a grasshopper, just this picture of this poor kid who's never been loved by anybody, and he's looking at a grasshopper and he's saying, like, how do you think they make that song? It's an opportunity to leave himself and his life and appreciate other lives. There's well, I mean, Demon, his love story is completely surrounded with lightning bugs. He wants to get Dory out amid the fireflies. And when he talks to Emmy in the city, he's like, she doesn't even know about lightning bugs. This poor girl. So yes, it's a thread, and it's, when I say I love where I live and that we are blessed in Appalachia with resources galore, that's one of them. Our proximity to nature is a beautiful thing.
And the final question, the significance of water. One person during the last hour asked whether Demon felt landlocked and surrounded, and that was his desire, to see the ocean.
To see the ocean. Yeah, I mean, probably somebody someday will write a thesis about the importance of water in Demon Copperhead. For me, I mean, why, I have actually asked myself, why did this kid need to see the ocean?
Yeah.
That's completely Demon. That did not come from Dickens, because David Copperfield actually lived, like, he was walking distance from the ocean. He saw the ocean a lot. So why did I think of that? Well, for a Lee County kid, a lot of kids I know have never seen the ocean, because even though we're in Virginia, we're 7 hours from the ocean. People don't know Virginia is a long state. It reaches into the Appalachian Mountains. So that a lot of kids around here rarely cross a county line. When my daughter was a senior in high school here, they her class went on a trip, and they needed to get, it's like to the Bahamas or something. She was the only kid in her class who already had a passport. So it's another thing about rural life. We don't have the opportunities to travel that can sort of, it's
enlarge our world. Yeah.
Right, that's been taken from us. And that, for me, seeing the ocean, for kids around here, going to Myrtle Beach is like, for other kids or other people, maybe like going to Paris. That's like the biggest thing you can imagine. So it seemed very natural that Demon would long to see the ocean. But it's probably also because I started this book looking at an ocean, looking at the window at the ocean. And we're running out of time. This time has flown by. I want to say thanks to your beautiful audience, your readers out there.
Aren't they terrific with
they're
such
fabulous.
Wonderful questions?
Well, and I want to thank you and all y'all, as we say here, for reading literature, because I mean, sort of hearkening back to these divides and what we were talking about earlier about the sort of people becoming disconnected from one another and the dangers of that. Literature connects us. Literature,
Indeed.
when you read a novel, you put yourself on the night table and you enter another life. I think that's the most important thing that we can do for our souls and for our ourselves as a people, is to imagine other lives.
What a fabulous way to bring this wonderful conversation to a close, Barbara. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was just wonderful, and your book is glorious.
Well, thank you, Diane, and thank all of you for paying attention to Appalachia. We need you.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you again, God willing. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And a quick note, our April book club meeting will be a little different. Since I'll be out of town, we've decided it might be fun to turn the tables on me, with the producer of the book club, Allison Brody, asking questions that you might want me to answer. So you can submit those via a form we'll send out. So do watch your inbox for more information. And on the last Wednesday of April, you'll receive a link to that recorded interview. And finally, before you go, please take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event that's going to pop up on the screen. I really would appreciate it if you'll do that. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Adrian Danhauser is our engineer today. Allie Dickman is our events director. We had so much help from Michelle Keegan, Verendra Silva, Lauren Centrella, Carly Cloud, Jerry Washington, and Michelle Morgan. Thanks to all of them and to you. I hope to see you next month. I'm Diane Rehm.